What's up, everyone? You're listening to Hey Man, the advice podcast for men. I'm Avi Klein.
I'm Sam Graham Felson.
I'm a therapist. Sam's a novelist. Each week, we answer one of your questions and hopefully get a few of our own questions answered as well. Our guest this week is Zach Iscol. Zach is a decorated combat veteran, a Grand Marshal of New York City's 2019 Veterans Day Parade, and the founder of several companies, including Hirepurpose and Purpose. He also founded Headstrong, an organization dedicated to helping veterans heal from PTSD. Zach helps us with a question this week from a man who's struggling to take responsibility after messing up at work. Thanks for coming on again.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, and we're going to try something a little bit different.
Okay.
You're our guinea pig. So we'll get to the question later,
Yep.
but the theme of the question, or like the guy who's writing, is someone, my impression after reading it, and later I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but was just someone who's struggling with responsibility and like being a responsible person.
Okay.
And, you know, reading your bio, like you strike me as like a very responsible, on top of it guy.
Mom, are you listening? Is my wife listening?
And I
Hear
guess
that,
I was curious. I mean, like you've like founded like a bunch of companies, and I mean, I guess I also was thinking about your experience as a Marine, where like, there's such a, I imagine a sense of discipline instilled, but I was wondering if you have experiences with irresponsibility.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
100%. If you should be talking to my parents.
What would they say?
My dad growing up, I think like probably more often than not, I'd hear, you'd lose your freaking head if it wasn't attached to your shoulders. You know what I mean? It was like...
By the way, you're allowed to swear on this.
Yeah.
Oh, you are allowed to
Yes.
swear. Great, good. Yeah, certainly. I think I grew up in... I was very fortunate. I have two really, really incredible parents who... my dad is just turned 80. He's from Jamaica, Queens.
Mm-hmm.
His dad died when he was 13. He went to work the very next day. He was what they call like a pin monkey at a bowling alley. So his job was to like set up the pins, you know, for bowlers before they had the machines. And he then used his father's GI Bill to go to college. Became a very successful entrepreneur. My mom was a public school teacher here in the city at PS 45, and then they moved out of the city. She worked in education her entire life. But I definitely kept them busy with irresponsibility. But I think one of the things that they did really well, especially my dad, is he was very, very big on lessons. So when I would fuck up, it was an opportunity to teach me a lesson. So there was, you know, one Halloween, me and this kid, Will Clarkson. Will Clarkson was a troublemaker. And he was one of my close friends. And we got in some trouble on Halloween, you know, with shaving cream and cherry bombs. And you know, when my dad found out about it, you know, he had me out there the next morning on that street at 6 a.m. cleaning up the street. And then once it was an appropriate time, knocking on everybody's doors, apologizing, telling them that I'm sorry for what I did. I cleaned up your mailbox, cleaned up your trees. And then the next point was, what can I do to make it better? Like that wasn't enough. And so time and again, when I would fuck up, he would find a way of embodying some lesson into it.
What was that like for you? I also was like kind of a troublemaker. And I remember when my parents, it was my mom, I think, who was more on top of like figuring out how to make it right.
Yeah.
It always felt really good to me, like to be held accountable in some way. Like it's funny, like even though I got into trouble, like I liked being held accountable.
For sure. And I think with my parents, the big thing was honesty was always critical. You know, it's like the one thing they didn't want was I couldn't smoke cigarettes. If I smoked cigarettes, I was out of the house. Marijuana, they're like, if you want to try marijuana, like talk to us first. If you want to drink, don't drive. That was a big thing. But cigarettes were like a huge no-no. You know, my dad would have crushed me if I ever smoked a cigarette. But other than that, it was really about honesty and taking responsibility for your actions. And, you know, you're going to fuck up in life.
So had you kind of like got your head on straight by the time you made it to the Marines, or were there still lessons to be learned?
There was still definitely a lot of lessons to be learned. And I was fortunate in college. I played lightweight football at Cornell, and I had a phenomenal football coach named Terry Cullen, who was a Marine officer in Vietnam, Silver Star recipient, badly wounded. And I definitely kept him busy. You know, he he was a mentor. He sort of kept me on track, and was sort of one of the forces that drove me towards joining the Marine Corps as opposed to the other services. But I think just at different stages, I was fortunate enough to have a mentor to learn from.
When did you have the inkling that you wanted to serve in the military? Do you remember like what age you started?
Always been there. I think I grew up in a family where almost all the men had served. My dad came from a Gold Star family, so his uncle was killed in World War II. He was a radio operator and navigator on a bomber, and the bomber was shot down over Europe. And growing up, when he was growing up, every Sunday he'd go over to his parents' house, and then they'd go to the cemetery to visit, his uncle's grave. And so I grew up with stories about Uncle Chet, from my grandma and her experiences with the war. My grandma's second husband, because my dad's dad died when he was little, was Papa Lou, who was like a grandfather to me. He was a tank driver in Europe. My dad's dad had served in World War II. My dad was in the Air Force. We grew up with a lot of Holocaust survivors being Jewish, and so there was that connection. And so I think it was, for me, I was always drawn to the military. There was never a question that I was going to do anything else in my 20s. And to be honest, I couldn't imagine doing anything else in my 20s. There was a sense of adventure and purpose in joining the service.
So playing football for a Division I school gives you some
lightweight football.
Lightweight football. Okay. But you had some idea.
It's a varsity sport, but it is for smaller guys like myself.
Okay. But you had some idea of what sort of a regimented, disciplined life felt and looked like. But I'm always curious, like when I meet people who've served, like what the transition is like going from just being someone with total freedom to wake up at like noon if you feel like it, drink as much as you want the night before, right. Do anything, and then all of a sudden you're in training, and there are all of these rules all of a sudden, and like, is it overwhelming? Do you get used to it quickly? What was that like?
No, I don't do well without structure. So my freshman year of college was a disaster. I went to boarding school. I came to college. I was sort of cocky and thought I knew everything. Didn't really have any imposed structure. And this was sort of one of the things that Terry Cullen sort of helped, my coach sort of helped impose was that structure. But if I don't have that structure, I don't thrive. So I sort of, in college, sort of created it through football. Had somebody like Terry Cullen who was sort of helping me create that structure. And then the military certainly helps provide it as well. And now in my life, I just sort of need to figure out ways to create it myself.
How did your coach help you with that? Like it sounds.
I think it was basically an ultimatum. Like if you don't get your grades up, and this is how you get your grades up, you go to class and you study. And if you don't do these things, then you're not going to be playing football. Like it was pretty much that simple. And so it's like, Friday night, like after a game, like, no, you shouldn't be going out with the team because your grades aren't good enough. And like you should be going to the library, or you should be going and studying. And so I think that ultimatum just sort of was it.
So I guess a month after you enlisted, 9/11 happened.
Yeah. So I was commissioned August 11th, 2001. And a month later, 9/11 happened. I was actually hunting in Canada. Excuse me. I was hunting in Canada, and we were elk hunting. So when you're elk hunting, you sort of go out in the woods for days at a time. And we'd been out in the woods for, I think, like 5 days maybe. And then we came back to this little hunting cabin for a night. And then we were going back out for like another 4 or 5 days. And I just remember I left the cabin and get in the truck to go out on the field, came back in just to get another piece of French toast. And we heard it on the radio that a plane had hit the World Trade Center.
Wow. What was your reaction? Do you remember?
Well, I remember at that time I thought maybe it was just an accident. It was just over the radio. Right. But my college girlfriend, who remains to this day one of my best friends, she worked down there.
Oh, wow.
And so I immediately was very concerned for her and her safety. So we drove to town. There's a hunting guide that we were with, and so I went over to his house. Really nice Canadian guy. And we just turned on the news, and then I started frantically trying to call her, trying to call my family. Turns out she worked at Deutsche Bank at the time, and she was was actually on a recruiting trip up at Cornell for the bank. So she wasn't even in town.
We have a weird thing in common. We were both in Canada on 9/11.
Were you really?
I was in Canada on 9/11 because I was actually in an airplane
Really?
that was grounded, and I'll never forget this. The pilot, because usually when something's going wrong, they don't actually tell you. They're just like, there's some issue. We're going to resolve it, but we have to land. But the pilot literally was like, we just got some call in about some potential terrorism, so we're gonna have to land. And so I was on the ground.
Where'd you land? In Toronto?
In Newfoundland.
There's like a play about.
There's a Broadway
Is there really?
smash Broadway hit about this that I still haven't seen. But anyway, so
like 300 planes or something like that were all grounded.
I mean, the thing I'll
Newfoundland.
never forget was that as the plane was pulling into this sort of like rural airport that looked kind of like a farm. There was like old wood fencing. Like there were just hundreds of Canadians like taking pictures of all these planes, just like nose to tail on the runway. I was like, something really weird is going on here. So anyway, that's a story for another day. But
I'm thinking about being enlisted and 9/11 happening and like that surge of patriotism that happened after that, and that must have been a really powerful feeling to be.
I mean, were you either one of you in New York City after 9/11?
I had just left it. That was my first like week in college or second week in
but your
college.
family lives
my
downtown.
family lives downtown. Yeah.
The city was, it was devastating.
Yeah.
Right. And there are these moments where you see groups of firefighters or groups of police officers walking together. They were coming from funerals because there was just funeral after funeral after funeral in the city. But there was also like this remarkable sense of unity and coming together. Mm-hmm. I remember the Yankees World Series, taking the train up to see the games with my dad. And, you're sort of on this train. You also have the anthrax stuff that's going on at the same time in the city. And everybody's kind of a little skittish and worried, but like, you're like, fuck it. We're going to show up together. We're going to be together and we're going to go to the Yankees game, and the Yankees are in the World Series. And
there's like a real like tenderness to the city. I remember coming home and all of those, like by St. Vincent's Hospital and stuff, like all the notes and like the tiles and stuff and all. Yeah.
But obviously like you had just been commissioned, so you still had to be trained.
So I still had to be trained. So I ended up going to the next school you go to. So you go to the way the Marine Corps works is you go to Officer Candidate School, which is more of sort of like a selection process. You don't really you get trained enough just so that they know that you're going to be a good officer. And then between that and a college degree, you get your commission. So you're commissioned as a second lieutenant, but you don't know jack shit. The next school you go to is called the basic school. So every Marine officer, regardless of what their specialty is, they go to the basic school and you learn the basics of being a Marine officer, the basics of leading a platoon, admin, land navigation, how to use a radio. And that's a 6-month course. And then from there, everybody goes on to their specialty to be a supply officer, logistics, infantry, tanks, aviation. I went in, had a guaranteed flight contract. I was supposed to go to flight school. And flight school is about a 2 to 3 year program. And I was worried if I went to flight school, I'd miss the war. So I dropped my flight contract, went infantry.
You were wrong about that.
I was wrong. I think last I looked at my watch, the war is still going on. It might even be expanding. Yeah.
So you went to Iraq. What year was that?
So I did. So after the basic school, I went to the infantry officer course, and then I deployed on a Marine Expeditionary Unit, which is like a bunch of Marines on Navy ships to the Middle East, and we went ashore in Iraq for a short period of time. So it was my first time in Iraq. That was after the initial invasion. It was pretty quiet, pretty uneventful. Coming back from that deployment was when 4 Blackwater contractors were killed in the city of Fallujah. And things were starting to heat up out in the western parts of Iraq in a place called Al Anbar province. And my platoon sergeant and I, who is one of my closest friends to this day, we sort of basically volunteered to go out with the next deploying unit, which was 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine. So as soon as we got home, crossed over to the other battalion. Then a couple months later, we were back out the door with 3-1. And so landed in, I think, June of 2004.
I one of my hobbies is I like to actually listen to military podcasts, and one of the things that comes up is just like listening to different veterans. Like some veterans are very aware that like there's a real risk that they could die. And other veterans are just like, oh, no, that'll never happen to me. You know, like it'll be fine. Like there's this one guy who talks about like, even if like a plane was crashing, he'd still have the attitude, like, I'm still going to survive. Like whatever. I'm curious, like, what were you doing to mentally prepare? Were you in the camp of like, I'm not going to think about it. It's like, it's not going to happen to me. Or were you like consciously, you know, considering your mortality?
I was not consciously considering my mortality. And it's not because I'm not trying to sound brave or anything. I think you are so busy in that when you're there, and especially as I was dual hatted on the deployment. I was a platoon commander and a company XO, so I had 2 different jobs. And you have so much to do constantly that you don't have time to think about that. I mean, there's one moment actually in Fallujah where we had called in a danger close artillery strike, so we were. That means that so you're within the max effective range of an artillery round when you call it in that close to your position. So we called in a danger close artillery strike, which means you're hunkered down, preparing for these rounds of artillery to come in. And so we're hunkered down, and we hear this screaming noise, and I think it's the artillery, and huge explosion, and it's like not just danger close, like it's on top of us. And so I'm yelling in the radio, check fire, check fire, check fire. And turns out an F-16 had accidentally dropped a 500-pound bomb about 40 meters from our position. And it's just because of the mitigating effects of urban terrain that we were okay. But afterwards, my guy named Corporal Martinez, who's now a sergeant major in the Marine Corps, and he was my acting platoon sergeant at that time because of some folks that got wounded. He and I just looked at each other. We had to evacuate a couple guys after that, and we put our backs up against this wall, after we sort of dealt with the whole situation and after sort of the dust had cleared and we evacuated our wounded. And he handed me a cigarette, even though I said to my parents that I would never smoke. And
well, now your dad knows.
Now my dad knows. He handed me a cigarette. We're smoking a cigarette, and he just looked at me. He's like, "Do you think we're dead? Like, do you think like we're just like,
wow,
are we like ghosts right now, like just stuck in the city of Fallujah?" And
what a mind fuck.
It was quite a mind fuck.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a couple of those in that city.
I wonder, I want to ask you about the organizations you started, particularly Headstrong, but I wonder when we think about, but before getting into PTSD and stuff, it seems to me just from, listening to veterans talking, reading books by veterans, et cetera, that like one of the most difficult transitions back into civilian life is like going from literally life or death situations of maximal importance and meaning, where your decisions could mean somebody that you care about living or dying,
right,
to like having to go grocery shopping because you ran out of diapers, right? Can you just, what was that transition like for you? And like, can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah. Yeah.
It was slow. I mean, I think it's different for everybody. Excuse me. That's a good question. I think it's really different for everybody. For me, and this probably has a lot to do with sort of my parents and how for them it was always important that you find meaning and a lesson in everything. For me, it was really important that I sort of capture the lessons from this experience and, in a way that other folks won't have to repeat the mistakes that I had made in and out of combat. And so I ended up making a film. We showed it at the Tribeca Film Festival called the Western Front. I went back to Iraq to film it. But that, for me, was sort of, really therapeutic, right? Taking these experiences and then sort of processing them, talking about them, but then also trying to put something out there that somebody could watch and maybe they don't make the same mistakes I made. I think in terms of like the military though, like, there's, the military gives you a lot of structure. The military does give you a sense of purpose. There's a lot of camaraderie. And I think not everybody in the military serves in combat. Not everybody in the military experiences even danger. There's a lot of folks who don't, but I think it's more when most folks leave the military, you suddenly are out here in this world, you don't have that structure. There's a lot of folks that join the military and they know from day one of their lives they want to join the military, but they're not familiar with or knowledgeable about what they want to do when they come out of the military. And so I think, there's just a lot of different ways people struggle coming out.
And
thrive coming out.
Right. I mean, and you had filled that vacuum of like, how do I find a sense of purpose by doing a lot of meaningful things, making a film, starting nonprofits, starting a business.
Yeah.
But I'm also just curious before we move on to other stuff, like just in the day-to-day, like minutia stuff, was that hard for you? Just like doing just everyday banal tasks that like we have to deal with. Like,
I was an officer. It's like, yes, you still have to deal with some of that stuff.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's just doing the work, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what it is. You just sometimes you don't get to choose. Which I think one of the first things I had to do in Iraq was an investigation. I can't remember what it was. There was an investigation into like some lost piece of gear. And like you're going out to different units and like you're looking at serial numbers and you're interviewing Marines and you're like how is this helping anything? But at the end of the day, like having that level of accountability in a unit does help, right? And so I think it's there is a level of banality to it, but it is what it is.
It strikes me that you sort of pouring yourself into different projects and processing it in that way seems incredibly adaptive. And I'm wondering, like, other people you served with who you've noticed like have just had a harder time making the transition. Like, what do you notice? Like, what are the qualities that make it harder for some people?
It's a big question. I think I don't know. I can speak from sort of experience more broadly in terms of the work we do at Headstrong and what we see there. But I think that there's like the biggest thing is just a reluctance for people to get help, and I think it's the reluctance is based partly on the stigma around mental health care. I think there's also, though, more than the stigma, more than the stigma, there's a lot of ignorance around mental health care. And so I think there's just a lack of knowledge that contributes.
What are the things that like you have heard over the years when talking to fellow veterans, like who are reluctant to seek mental health care? Like, do people think it's like soft? Do they think it's phony? Like, what do people think?
I think they think it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
They think they're fine, right? And they're fine until they're not fine, and then when they're not fine, that's when things go really far south.
Yeah.
But a lot of folks don't understand. Like, they'll talk about. I have a good friend who used to work at Headstrong, and he talks about this experience. But he was starting to have anxiety and panic attacks, and he was going to, I think it was a birthday party or something, and he's having a really bad panic attack. And he gets to the party; it's at a bar, and he has a beer. He has a second beer, and it goes away. And his wife is with him. His wife is really smart. Thoughtful young woman, and he's like, "Oh man, I feel so much better after the second beer." And she looks at him and she's like, "Yeah, that's called self-medicating." And a light bulb went off in his head, and he's like, "Oh, this is self-medicating." And what he didn't know at the time is that those anxiety and panic attacks were a symptom of something that was treatable. And most people don't make that connection for whatever reason. I think it's lack of knowledge, lack of education, lack of familiarity. They're not taught it.
You feel free to decline this question, but did you have PTSD, or do you think you? Like...
I'm sure yes. So my sort of theory of PTSD is something that helps you survive and thrive in dangerous situations.
Yeah.
Right. And you think about the symptoms of PTSD: hypervigilance, anxiety, and panic attacks. I mean, if you're thinking about before a wrestling match or a baseball game or a football game, or before you go public speak, right, you start to get jittery. Your body starts to, it's your body starting to prepare to react. It's getting ready to either fight or flight. And those are physical symptoms that help you survive and thrive in dangerous situations. Sleeplessness, restlessness, These are all things that are helping you prepare to fight or flight. What happens through prolonged trauma is you start to get to a point where you can't turn off the fight or flight symptom. And what most people don't realize is that's not reversible. And certainly when I got out, I had symptoms of PTSD, and certainly like I was quicker to anger, and certainly I can give you experiences where I did things I wasn't proud of. You know, and at the time I was not knowledgeable about PTSD I wasn't knowledgeable that mental health care can help. I wasn't knowledgeable that if you go to therapy, these are things that can be dealt with. And so I think that's the biggest sort of hill we have to climb, is educating people about what this is and that it's treatable. Even
the idea that like everybody has some form of PTSD, I think could be a really liberating idea, because you know, the old way of thinking about it was like, oh, well, only certain dudes got PTSD, but like dudes who really had their shit together didn't, right? And I think
is it basically assumed at this point that like if you
on a
like
spectrum,
the way when I say I think everybody has some level of PTSD, what I mean is that those symptoms of PTSD, right? That quickness to react, that hypervigilance, that restlessness, these are things that help you thrive in dangerous situations.
Like just as part of like
as part of like
the threat response system.
It is the threat response system, like that. That's what I mean.
Totally.
That continues afterwards. Not everybody has that.
But I guess I was wondering, like, because it kind of seems like a no-brainer to me. Like, if you see combat, like, how could you not have PTSD after that? Like, that's a traumatic.
Because I think that there's also, there's been a lot of studies that have shown that trauma compounds upon itself, right? So 47% of the folks that we see at Headstrong have adverse childhood experiences.
Wow.
Right? I know somebody that has said that the hallways he grew up in were scarier than the hallways of Fallujah. And, so I think, yes, there is, I think some of it is just based on what's your previous trauma.
Yeah.
And
that makes sense.
If you've had a lot of trauma, you're probably going to come home with PTSD. If you haven't, and it's your only experience with trauma or with danger, you might be much better off. I don't know.
Can you just give us a quick sense of what the treatment looks like at Headstrong? And
so it varies. So we don't believe in a panacea. We don't believe that there's a one size fits all approach to treating PTSD. And I think part of this is also, as I sort of mentioned already, that everybody's coming to us with different backgrounds, right? Some folks have really, really terrible adverse childhood experiences in childhoods. Other folks, have 8, 10, 12 combat deployments. Some folks have military sexual trauma, right? So there's and then people have different sort of dispositions and propensity for PTSD, and they deal with it in different ways. Some folks lash out at their spouse, other folks reach for the bottle, some folks do both. Some folks participate in dangerous activities, right? It manifests itself in a lot of different ways. So the first thing for us is we really don't believe that there's a panacea or a one-size-fits-all approach. And so when somebody reaches out to us, and that's the only thing we require in our treatment program, is that somebody reaches out to us. After that, it's bureaucracy-free, cost-free, confidential, and effective. And so somebody reaches out to us on our website within a short period of time, usually 4 to 8 hours, at the most 48 hours, a clinician from our team will reach out to them on the phone, get on the phone with them. During that phone call, they make sure that they are not a threat to themselves or somebody else. And then they spend the rest of that time on the phone really identifying the problem that they're trying to solve. So it's much less about diagnosing PTSD and much more about why are you reaching out to us? You can't sleep at night. That's one thing. You're having panic attacks. That's another thing. You have an issue with your spouse. You have an issue at work. You have an issue with drugs or alcohol. Let's identify what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And then we schedule a time for them to see a psychiatrist in their community. We're in 25 cities around the country. They see that psychiatrist for 1 to 2 sessions. They get an initial diagnosis, make sure they're a good fit for outpatient care. And then what we do in these 25 cities is we've built networks. We have 250 clinicians around the country who are trained in a variety of modalities, all with 10 plus years of experience, all with certain qualifications in terms of trauma therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR. EMDR we found is very effective.
What does that stand for?
Eye movement desensitization
and reprocessing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so EMDR is a big one. We have substance abuse specialists, alcohol addiction, marriage, sexual counseling, sexual trauma counseling, sex addiction. So we have not only geographic diversity in a city or communities that people can get to their therapist pretty easily, but also diversity of skills. And based on what the problem is they're trying to solve and what their needs are, and sometimes just what type of person they want to see, right? I want to see a woman. I want to see a man. It's really important to me. This person has this type of experience, is older, younger, whatever it is. We then send them to see that therapist. And then from there, that therapist sends their notes to a HIPAA compliant system to our team at Cornell Medical Center, which is our medical team here in the city. And then they participate in case conferences once a month so we can manage each case. And then based on how things are working for that client who we're paying to get treated, we'll change the treatment for them. We'll adopt it in conjunction with what works for them. You know, some clients, you know, the last thing they want to do is exposure therapy. They just don't want to have to think about their experiences. Others, you know, something like EMDR works really, really well.
What? Just quickly, either of you can jump in because I know you know what these things are too. What is exposure therapy and how does EMDR actually physically work?
So EMDR it's pretty remarkable. When we first started doing it, I thought it was batshit crazy.
Yeah, it sounds like magic.
It sounds like crazy magic, and but essentially what it is PTSD is a physical response to trauma, right? So it's the inability to turn off the fight or flight response. It's your body preparing to react to danger. And it's preparing to react to danger when there is no danger. But you have a triggering event, a car backfires, a memory, something happens that triggers this response. And then you have this physical reaction, sweaty palms, restlessness, anger, whatever it is, inability to sleep. And so EMDR, you are processing those memories. So you're doing talk therapy.
You're doing that.
While you're holding a panel.
Yeah, I'm seeing you.
Yeah. So while you're holding these two buzzing panels or you're following a light, it's essentially you're doing something physical and something like with these buzzing panels while you are processing the memory with a trained clinician. And what that does is that disaggregates the physical response from the memory. And so the memory now becomes a real memory that's in the past and not something that you feel is happening to you in that moment. And so that's one of the reasons EMDR, I think, is so effective, is it disaggregates the physical response from the memory.
So it's like cutting the cord between the memory and the physical response. Yeah. Okay. And exposure therapy.
Well, that is so in a way that allows you to re-expose yourself to the memory without being overwhelmed.
There's a great Gary Larson cartoon about exposure therapy, which is like, I don't know, I think it works for some people and it's evidence-based, but it's a cartoon of a guy in a box. He's afraid of heights, afraid of snakes, and afraid of the dark. So they put him in a box on a crane that's full of snakes to expose him to all of his fears so that he's not afraid of these things anymore. Right. So for some folks, that can be re-traumatizing. For others, you learn like, oh, I don't need to be afraid of the dark.
Usually you build up slowly so that it's like I remember like someone who is afraid of being in an elevator, right? And like, so first you're like on the first floor outside of the elevator, maybe standing in the elevator, someone's holding the door open, you know, go up one flight, you know what I mean? Like instead of like going to the Empire State Building and going all the way up.
Yeah.
So, addicts can obviously, relapse. You've said that PTSD is 100% curable. After you've been cured, could you relapse back into fight or flight?
So, look, you're going to live your life, right? And in life, you're going to suffer from new traumas. You're going to have new breakups. You're going to have things are going to happen in life, and you're going to respond to those things. And, you know, I think after treatment, you have tools to respond in a more healthy, productive way. But one of the great things about Headstrong is we don't limit the number of sessions. Doors are always open. We have folks that, you know, will see us for 6 to 8 months. They'll be the best version of themselves. Something will happen a year, 2 years later, and they'll come back for a checkup, and they'll come back for 2 or 3 sessions. But I do think it's, in some ways, it is like going to the gym, that you do build up a resiliency and a strength.
We should get to the advice question, but I just want to ask one more thing about the work that you do. I mean, you also started Task and Purpose, which is a digital publication that covers the military. You have a company that matches veterans to jobs.
Yeah.
How important is it for veterans to just hang out with other veterans in terms of like not just keeping PTSD at bay, but just I don't know, just having that sense of not aloneness when you come back?
I don't know. I mean, that sort of varies from veteran to veteran. I think from my perspective, it's one of the most remarkable communities. You know, I love vets, right? Like
what do you love about, like, for people who have no exposure to the military? I think it's kind of hard to understand.
You know, in some ways, we're living in a time where our country is very, very divided, right? Like, and there's too much daylight between all of us, you know, as Americans. And I think that there's something about this community that, you know, I have friends who I can't stand their politics, and we argue back and forth on Facebook, and we're at each other's throats. But at the end of the day, you know, they are also somebody who, you know, I know loves this country. I know that they are good, decent people, right? I know that we care about the same things, and we sort of ultimately want the same objective. I know they have been willing to put their lives on the line for me and me for them. And I think there's something really just special about that community, and it transcends religion, it transcends race, it transcends gender. You know, the community has been some people in the community have been behind on some issues or ahead on some issues, but I think for the most part, it's just that shared sense of purpose and community, irreverence. I mean, the jokes that go on in this community are just awful. There's a level of dark humor that is applied to everything, and it's you know. So I think it's just sort of that like combination of all of that.
Let's get to the advice question.
All right, so all right, here we go. Let's find out. Hey, man, I'm 24 years old, and a little over a year ago, I got an office job after working at restaurants when I graduated college. The culture is very bro-y, which is fine. I can fit in, and there's a lot of good-natured teasing. But last month, something happened, and it's making me want to leave this job. A few weeks ago, I completely slept through my alarm clock. I woke up to tons of texts from my office and panicked. I lied and said my mom had an emergency and I was helping her with it. I ended up calling out that day, came in the next day, and seemingly everything was fine. Then, at our office Christmas party, management was handing out awards for the year. I expected to get one because I worked my ass off and was really disappointed when I was passed over. Then they gave out joke awards and I got most likely to skip work. People were laughing, and someone even said, "How's your mom?" as if they knew I was lying. I was completely mortified. I had even brought my girlfriend, and she could tell I was pissed. I don't know what to do. I feel so betrayed by these guys and embarrassed. I just want to look for a new job. This is not the first time they've done something that I felt crossed a line, but it feels like the last straw. What do you think? Should I stay or should I go? Signed, Humiliated on Houston. What are your first impressions hearing that question?
But my impression is that this guy should take a deep breath, be willing to laugh at himself a bit, but also think a little bit about who's actually responsible for what happened, right? That, you know, he slept through his alarm, fine, that's an honest mistake, but then he lied about it,
yeah,
right? You know, like, to me, there's no reason to lie about something. He brought his mom into that lie. You know, and at the end of the day, like, sun's going to come up tomorrow. Nobody's going to lose their life over this. He's going to be fine. He still has a job, and he should just shrug it off and like work his ass off so he gets the award next year.
Yeah. I remember when I was, some of my first jobs out of college, I was like a real screw up, or just like I don't know, just did not have yet figured out what it really means to be like, to show up every day.
Yeah.
And was always trying to like worm my way out of things. So I have some empathy for like, just not getting it yet. And
yeah, one of my first jobs, I worked at a fish market, and when I was, I worked there for 7 years over summers. And one summer when I was in high school, My boss was an amazing woman named Betsy Larson, and there was like a high school party the night before, and I got too drunk and showed up the next morning really hungover, and I remember working at the fish market, and I just felt like crap, and I probably still smelled like alcohol, and she pulled me aside and she looked at me, and she was the toughest boss I ever had, including any boss I had in the Marine Corps, any drill instructor, and she just gave me this look, and she said, "Don't ever come into work again like that, or you won't be coming into work again here."
Mm.
And it's part of growing up and part of learning, I guess. But like, I was fortunate I had somebody like Betsy Larson who wasn't going to fire me on the spot, gave me a second chance, and you live and learn. This guy should just live and learn.
Live and learn.
Yeah, I mean the thing that just stuck out to me was the lie, and I think like all of us lie when we're younger, especially, and then like definitely I've noticed the older I've gotten, the less tolerance I have for other people lying, and also the more I just realize that like, I mean sometimes lies are necessary. Like there's an example is, if someone who's in a really fragile state is like, "Do I look okay right now?" You shouldn't be like, "No, you look like shit," right? But so often lies are not actually necessary, right? And like part of being a mature, responsible adult is like not just defaulting to a lie. And it just like struck me that like, again, this is easier said than done. I don't want to sound holier than thou with this guy, but like, had he just said to his boss, "Gosh, I'm really, really fucking embarrassed about this." He could have even used the word fucking to make it seem more human. "I'm really embarrassed about this. I slept through my alarm. I can't believe it. I'll set a second alarm tomorrow to make sure it doesn't happen again." Like everyone would have been cool with it. It would have been fine. He ended up humiliating himself because like he was caught in a lie. Everyone knew that he was lying, and he used his mom as an excuse. I mean, that's also the worst possible kind of lie, is be like, there's a medical emergency in my family with the most important person in my life.
Like it's a little too obvious.
It's like my grandma died or something, excuse. And it just,
I'm also superstitious. So you never want to go there with never use a medical emergency.
Yeah. But he but it seems to me that like just reading into the subtext of this, that like if they're making fun of him being like, "Oh, is your mom okay?" Maybe this wasn't the first time that he used this kind of excuse, because they could tell that he's kind of a guy who seems a little flaky. And
there's something about him too that's he's not taking responsibility for
absolutely
what happened,
not. Yeah,
right, and that's. You can't own what other people are going to do. People are going to do what they're going to do. You can only really you can take responsibility for your reactions and your actions. And that's the biggest piece of advice I'd have for this guy, is just take responsibility for who you are, what you did, and for what happened.
I'm just thinking about like, I think you're right, and I'm thinking about right. He's sort of like, he's not taking responsibility because he doesn't want to feel embarrassed, is sort of like how I see that. Like if he owned it, like, "Oh, I fucked up," like that would feel bad. And so he's trying to like pretend in a way like it didn't happen. It's not a problem. And it takes a certain kind of like, I don't know, self-awareness or comfort with yourself to be like okay with having fucked something up.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts about like what it takes or how you, like, you must be the boss of a lot of people. You got a bunch of companies. Like, how do you help as a manager? Like, how do you help people?
Yeah, so
hear hard
one of the
news?
most important pieces of advice I got growing up. There's just, it's like 3 or 4 pieces of advice, but one of them was from my dad. So we were going on a camping trip, and my dad had bought me a Swiss Army knife for the camping trip, and we're getting ready to go. We're going to the Adirondacks, and my dad has a packing list, and I was probably I think I was in 3rd or 4th grade. I was little, and we are going down the checklist. You have your rain jacket, you have your backpack, your sleeping bag, Swiss Army knife. I lost a Swiss Army knife, and my dad's like, "All right, let's go." So we get in the car, drive to Bob's Sports, and he buys me another Swiss Army knife. And my dad is not the type of guy who would just be like, "Oh, no problem. Like, let me buy you a replacement." And he hands me the Swiss Army knife, and he says, I'll never forget it. He looks at me and says, "I am never going to buy you another Swiss Army knife for as long as you live." And he said, "But I want you to know that every man deserves a second chance." And he said, this was my dad. Every chance he had, he was finding a lesson in it. And he said, every man deserves a second chance. And he says, "I want you to remember that." And so for his 75th birthday, I bought him a little Swiss Army knife with, that I framed and put a little thing on it that said,
What a good dad.
he was a very strict dad. He was very, very tough. But he to this day is a wonderful father and friend.
Do you still have your
example.
Swiss Army knife?
I do. I do. Yeah, but he is, and so I think, you sort of sometimes have to be gentle with yourself. Sometimes you just have to give yourself a second chance. And I think especially when you're dealing with people, it's, for me, I sort of see my job as like, I just want to create environments where people can create the work that they're going to be most proud of, when they're old and with their grandkids and they're looking back in their life and they're like, yeah, that 5 years I spent at Headstrong, like that really meant something. Or, that 6 months we were in Iraq with Cap India, that meant something. And I think part of that is, when you find really good, hardworking people that care about what they're doing, and you're fortunate enough to find those types of folks, the mistakes they make are just honest mistakes, so it's, you can give them a little bit of a hard time for it, but you also know that the work they're doing day in and day out is having a huge impact, that they're working hard, that they're part of the team. And if they're not and they're toxic, then, they're sort of creating an environment that's the antithesis of what we're trying to do, and they no longer belong there.
You're making me think, since I'm a therapist, I always kind of go inside and what you just said about considering something an honest mistake. Like, in a way, it's like, I feel like this guy doesn't think of it as an honest mistake. If you have to cover it up, then you feel like, in a way, you feel like you did something wrong that you need to hide. And that's worth looking at. Like, did you? Like, are you being like, what did you do last night that you overslept the night before? Like, how are you engaging with your work that this is what happened? It didn't just start there.
Yeah.
I guess my only last lingering doubt with this guy is like, over this conversation, like, I've just appreciated that you've had a lot of teachers in your life and a lot of people who have like held you accountable, maybe in a loving way, maybe in like a firm way, but somehow you feel okay about this with yourself. But like, I'm imagining for this guy, maybe he hasn't had those experiences and he somehow has not learned that it's okay to, in a sense, feel like a failure, feel ashamed. And
he doesn't even have to feel like a failure. He doesn't think it's okay for him to just feel like he fucked up once.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or to admit that he made a mistake.
And
right?
so if we're all kind of concluding that that's what you need to learn to like be okay with this.
I still think there's a certain point where you can blame it on nurture, nature, experiences. If this guy's 24 years old, there's a time for him to
just
grow
do
up.
it. Just do it. That's
just do it and grow up.
We always end our show asking our guests if there's a particular piece of advice that that sticks out to them that they often come back to and maybe share with other people.
Yeah, I think that the one about second chances from my father is a big one. There's a couple others. One that comes to mind and is and I've shared this story a couple times before. But when I was in the Marine Corps, I had a instructor whose name was John Maloney. He was killed in Iraq in 2005, and we were doing our infantry officer training, which is one of the hardest courses in the Marine Corps, and it was late at night. Pulled all the officers inside, and he was sort of a legendary captain, and he asked us a simple question, which is, what comes first, your mission, the mission, or your Marines? And all of us knew we were going off to war, so we knew that this wasn't just theoretical. Like, we were going to be in a situation soon where we'd have to choose whether the mission meant more than the lives of our Marines. And Some guys thought, well, you always take care of your Marines and their lives matter more than any mission. And there's other guys that are like, no, you got to try to accomplish the mission. Like, that's what we're doing. That's what our job. And we sort of were arguing back and forth. And then somebody asked Captain Maloney, and his response was, I think you take care of your Marines and they take care of the mission. And I think, I think that's something that's off it. I think that has stuck with me in so many different levels. One is when you're fortunate enough to lead a team, your job is to take care of people, and make sure that they're set up to excel and succeed in their positions. But I think there's also something in there about just that, we have a responsibility to take care of other people and take care of each other. And I think that's something that's just also lost more and more these days. And so that's the advice that I would sort of impart, is to take care of each other.
Great. Thank you. Do you usually, like, when we have someone on here and they have like a social media presence, we're like, where can people find you? But you don't strike me as like someone.
No, I don't really have much.
Do you think like a lay person should read Task and Perp? And
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You mean a civilian?
Yeah, civilian. Lay
for
person.
Sure. And I think more civilians reading it, the better. I mean, so the job of Task and Purpose is, we entertain in order to inform. So we try and write about news and stories in a way that people are going to be entertained by it. But there's also real impact journalism that our team's doing. And so this year in particular, our team has done some work on something that would seem mundane to some civilians around, issues around military housing. But these are huge issues for military families. They played a big role in breaking a story about changes to the tax code that affected Gold Star families that had lost somebody and then got benefits. A lot of these families were bumped up to a 30 to 40% tax bracket. So they were getting crushed with taxes, and that was recently changed by law. They've done some work on something called the Ferez Doctrine, which essentially stipulates that if you are in the military and you suffer from medical malpractice, you can't sue the DOD or the VA for medical malpractice. So imagine that you're a family, you lost your breadwinner to medical malpractice. There's a ton of horror stories around this. There's no recourse, right? You're sort of just left out in the cold. So they made some modifications that they can now petition the DOD for severance, but they need to take it the next step and allow it to go to civilian courts. And so these stories, I think the point I'm trying to make is it's important that everybody reads these stories and cares about what's happening in the community.
So the website is taskandpurpose.com. And if there are any veterans listening who are interested in learning more about Headstrong, the website for that is
getheadstrong.org.
Awesome. Thanks so much for
thank you guys.
That's it for our show this week, everyone. As always, if you have a question, you can email us at heymanpod@gmail.com or give us a call, 917-426-4326. You can follow us on Instagram or Twitter at heymanpod. And if you have a second, give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And even better, click subscribe. Thanks so much. See you next week.